Hello everyone, today we talk briefly about the contacts between Asia and Europe before the 13th century, before the Mongol tide, that we'll have to address, in fact, briefly, as we kept that a bit aside, paradoxically, for a channel that deals mostly with medieval history. So this can serve as a broader introduction, right? In the series about the bestiaries, medieval animals and so on, we have seen how important for Western culture the idea of Asia in general, whether real or fantastic, or both at the same time, most of the times, especially without modern science and with the kind of world view and mindset that had actually a purpose at the time, but of course very different from us, had been throughout the millennia, because the contacts between Asia and Europe have always been, there's never even properly a boundary, and so these two continents and their, especially Asia, its very diversified cultures, had always been in deep connection with one another. You can argue that Europeans, as far as we understand historiographically speaking, were ones that, having also invented a different type of thinking since classical Greece, and so having an interest that we can define categorical by a certain degree, at least, encyclopedical, or at least something that had to frame what knowledge into some kind of boxes that eventually had a meaning, could give you the confidence of a word interpretation, were kind of more, at least, productive in terms of source making about regarding these transcontinental interests than what the Asians were, right? And you can argue that, broadly speaking, the great Asian civilizations had flourished, as you know, in fact, before of the European ones, and had developed importantly, dramatically. Asia was the birthplace of, properly, of agriculture, of writing, of sedentarism, right, and cities and so on. So something that had been the necessary for the emergence of civilization properly meant, and that this only gradually passed to Europe. But there is, say, a political social balance that, for reasons that we're not here to explain, was more autocratically oriented than what would become the West, right? And so we see these millenary civilizations in China, in India, etc., that, however, albeit very complex and very diversified, right, and having almost an ecumenic dimension in their, objectively, right, from properly in the spectrum of political and social organization, were shifted heavily in favor of some kind of central, theocratic power that managed, through the control of, the communities, also favored sometimes by the same spaces, in a way, the great rivers across which along which the great civilizations in the world were born first. In Europe, we don't have that. We don't have a major river that fundamentally concludes the whole continent as a huge valley, or multiple ones at least, that you can control in a way that helped partly, but it's, of course, geography is it's not even close to be, not just decisive, but even the main reason, right? There are also climatic reasons, etc., but it's not just material, right? There is something there that is random, that cannot be properly measured. I made a video about, by the way, diamonds, what's the video, about, guns, still, whatever the thing was, and that he stresses very much that aspect, which surely is important, but again, he doesn't even mention Alexander the Great once in his book, so we debunked it quite easily in so many ways along that ideal and political and military line that is somewhat ignored in this progressistic, almost technologistic and effectively deterministic idea of the world. And so there was, in this process of autocratization, also a subjugation of the masses that surely contributed to the development of the same system and the stability of the same, from which they partly profited themselves, to create, in fact, again, the great Chinese civilization, all these things, but didn't create, let's say, what Europe has been, I presume, mostly exemplified for and greatly tied to in its achievements, a middle class, right? The idea that at least there was not a unitary power, that was a continuous conflict, right? War actually is one of the most radically most important ingredients for the development of a civilization, right? As much as its greatest potential destroyer, but not all, right? As European history has proven dramatically well, and especially an idea of, let's say, in fact, of negotiation, right? Of that is exemplified in many of our culture, most prominently, common law, if you want to take this juridical bias. But not only in that, is at the root of the fact that Europe back in the days, like just today, is not a unitary thing. And even though it could act easily as one, and easily having the upper hand on the world again, there is no will for this. The reasons are, at this point, something we can't really digress on. But it's still divided, in fact, and it's still deriving its quality from it, from the fact that the quality of the individual elements that compose it derives from the same competitive relation with the others, and that there was not a flattening, right, in a let's say homogenization of certain characteristics that, however, can be seen exactly in this state of diversity. That is to say, we are uniform in that, we're homogeneous in that, we're used to think, after all, that we are Europeans exactly because, yes, we are divided and separated, but we are still one because of that specific reason, right? Which is something that nor leftists nor alt-righters, that are just a bunch of disgusting socialists at the end of the day, actually think, right? And so that idea of balance, and almost Aristotelian and in fact rational, scientific, in part also authoritarian, but in the sense of order, of discipline, and that is what effectively also overlapped with the greatest moments of the greatest achievements of European civilization, have expressed beautiful in itself, and this is the reason why, let's say, at least as a consequence of ingredients here that, as we were saying before, are also not to be given for granted, nor were deterministically to be in the first place, we also still and unavoidably study world history through the West, right? Because effectively there is not been any other civilization that has so powerfully and intensely and constantly produced such a huge amount of sources, right, of documents, of descriptions, of inquiries about the rest of the world like the West did, right? It doesn't matter that somebody, invented writing first or, did that first, etc. But, simply by the sheer scale, quantitatively and qualitatively, there is nothing that compares, right, with that. And this happened way before colonialism, right? You can argue that, yes, before that, there was a things were more balanced in the world along that pattern, but still the mentality between East and West has been and continues to be deeply different in nature, right? And we can see it easily in countries that we account as Western sometimes, that are not traditional, such as Japan, for example, right? In some lists, not even Brazil figures like a Western country, but Japan does, right? And you cannot, it naturally just depends on the criteria that you use, that can be very subjective in many ways, in fact. But yes, Japan has factually a democracy. It's a Western country in the essence of its political, economical, social reality, but in a cultural sense, in an ideal sense, they're something totally different, but deeply different, in the sense that you cannot really have a conversation with a person that comes from those backgrounds, in terms of for example, what world history has been about, simply because they're not taught, right? They have no idea. It's not that in the West we have the average person is this dramatic thing, but at least we're exposed, right? I always criticize the fact that, of course, no person in the world knows its own history just for being born in a country, and of course the average European or American or whatever doesn't factually know the ABC of its own history or culture anymore. Nor that before they knew it more, let's say, but the word at least was simpler before. But today it's going dramatically downhill. But at least the Westerner is aware of the fact that in depth that the world wasn't just a time where history is not just a time where there is an ancient divine creation and then kind of a line that remain, that the our mindsets remain just focused on and never looked away in a sensible way, right? You can argue that even Islam behaved, in fact, more like, in spite of the dramatic exposure to Western civilization, the fact that mostly its classical legacy, also for Europe to recover during the Middle Ages, was all Hellenistic, Roman in nature, and so on, actually ever opened so much like that the West properly did, right? The self-referentiality is a big problem. As Westerners, we're habituated to the idea that, yes, there is a long time ago, and that this long time ago is not a deterministically meant thing. And secondly, that we were not alone. That we have always been in the world with other peoples, with other cultures, and that we have dramatically interacted with them, and therefore our understanding, independently from the differences that do exist also within the West relatively to when, let's say, our collective memory wants to be started, have dramatically helped in putting things in perspective, and therefore giving a greater degree of objectivity and scientificity and moral depth to, right, compared to easily, yes, any other culture in the globe, right? This is not just to say that, of course, we were the first ones to abandon, to really bring to what we can really call a progress in humanity in terms also of rights, of properly, of quality of life, and so on, and of course, all the narrative that the Westerners were exploitative in the sense that they were worse than the others is just, failing badly at even in here, the ABC of human civilization, in realizing that those other cultures were overrun because we're radically more, brutal, obscure, violent, ambitious, and ferocious in ways that are even unspeakable to describe. That it was actually a fortune that some disappeared, or at least that were actually developed by the same Westerners, even in spite of, yes, colonialism was ferocious, was horrifying, etc., but it was in a sense of what the world is today, not because at the time was anything especially cruel or bad, and quantities have nothing to do with that. It's about the intrinsic quality of it, and like all of our ancestors from any culture at some point had a moral system based exclusively, and I want to stress exclusively, on raping, killing, and exterminating, because it was the only way to live, to survive and to go on. It was solely founded on a religious military principle. All the cultures in the world, and so the West is something that brought things forward. Sometimes, not even completely for the better. And we debate on this channel why that is the case, but still, in absolute terms, yes, for the overwhelming better of humanity. In fact, I don't consider a person that thinks otherwise belonging to my culture, to my identity, to who I am, because I'm not a moral relativist, and I have nothing to share with any somebody who isn't standing along these patterns. And I've studied too much history to know that it's very difficult to know history, but that there are certain things that are more evident the more you study history. So it's not a matter of personal opinion. And that also this is an important ground on which to set universal values, and essentially the human ones, that make you see that you cannot fool around just because you have a more partial view and so you have another perspective. That doesn't mean that you know better, right? And that, yes, that there is a universal standard and quality and understanding of history that you cannot fool around relative to these things. So there is, in other ways, there is no way to understand the world but studying also Western history. And by history in this sense, I mean also the production of Western historiography in the first place. Also because other realities are simply more obscure, and there is nothing to do with that either, right? So at least at certain satisfactory stages of development since effectively the first century, say the first millennium, across the first millennium BC AD, right? Now that's the moment in which the West achieves that, and it never stopped ever since. And so before that, there wasn't much that we can know even in detail about other civilizations, right? We know dramatically few, and it was not their fault in that regard. By that time, they were really on the forefront, right? And we're lucky enough, in fact, to have had them documenting the world for us at that point, and so we must study those in turn. But I can assure that I started from a completely different idea, because when you're younger, you know less. In fact, you're more relativistic in attitude. It's obvious, right? Because you're young, and that's when you have to bring all the info in and sort it out by yourself. And you couldn't. It would be dangerous at that point not to be kind of iconoclastic or kind of idealistic or even fanatic by a certain sense, and to say, hey, we have to debunk all the myths. No, Western centrism is bad. The more you go on, the more you recover that, because you understand why that came about, right? It's not just a chauvinistic narcissism that towards your own culture, civilization. As I said before, again, you have to earn that, right? A person that doesn't know their history, they can be born next to me or wherever in say in terms of cultural homogeneity in the West, but to me they're not Westerners. Like they don't fit what I think, the Western, and in this sense universal, because it really belongs to anybody at that point. And the West proved this dramatically well, because we got all in part in a successful way, as long as things worked well, right? Now they haven't worked anymore for quite a long time, but especially there are differences that cannot really erased from just in a generation, right? I'm very sympathetic to the idea that if you pick a single individual, it's always the same difference. I mean, collectively and individually. Like individually, yes, you can have, I don't know, I was talking about the Japanese first, let's say, or let's pick somebody who comes from a completely different opposite direction. I don't know, somebody from, I don't know, you tell me, Namibia, right? And you adopt them, and you educate it, in the standards of Western quality of life, etc. There is no difference at all, right? That's what racism is bullshit, is that properly there is nothing about that person that it may be influenced by the fact, of course, adoption is a complex thing. It does affect, in a way or another. I'm not saying it's a tragedy or a negative thing. On the contrary, more people should get adopted, in my opinion, and it should be more, easier. But let's say, aside from that realization, of course, there is a before. There is a legitimate curiosity to say, who were my ancestors? Where do I come from? Right? But does this have an importance? Right? You had there a perfect Westerner. Right, things are naturally more complicated with somebody that has been, raised in another situation, and their things are much more serious than you usually imagine. I have a decent experience, let's say, with especially within the boundaries of the same Western world, right, or what is perceived as such. And very curiously, sometimes not by the people that are part of it, because they consider sometimes the term Westerner narrowly meant or even as a negative thing, albeit being Westerners factually. But sometimes also with properly people that are came completely from the outside of the West, and that I must say I've been often pleasantly surprised from. I do have prejudices. I think that we all have, and prejudices are, as long as they're neutral, they're just statistically based. You can't say that's fine. Pleasantly surprised because I realized how much of universal values actually we all share, right? So that we can really, in the absence of a vicious influence that unfortunately exists in realities where democracy lacks, or there also the past has been still very heavy. This is true also in the West, right? There is a real, in simplicity especially, there is goodness. This you can test even within the same West. I don't know, when you if you go in the countryside, if you meet distant relatives that still live maybe away from the city and in the country, they haven't quite changed from the time of your grandparents in a way. You understand that there is especially the elderly, and you understand that there is a purity in the simplicity. It is true, right? The way progress brought on the fore certain so much energies that we can't even recollect. We don't even know how to cope with. Has polluted morally the world in many ways, in spite of bringing it dramatically on the fore from a material point of view, of which we should be happy and also thankful for the same countries from which this happened, which again it's a bit obviously a pro-Western realization, but it is also true that cultural differences are, especially in those cases where you really come from a more structured, a richer culture, right? Something that developed for a longer time and that had more time to sediment some kind of beliefs and etc. That it's more difficult to cope with, and you cannot really erase hundreds or if not thousands of years just by saying, okay, I will expose you to these universal values and to reason and to logic and to science and morality. Very often we make a bad work with that too, because again, ever since mass society kicked in, we had huge problems, and to maintain a relative balance, and we're very self-centered in a way and self-referential. So sometimes we properly don't have an idea of how to cope with other cultures, because first of all we don't know them, and secondly we think that they should just fit our own standards, and that's not how it works. And this yes does make a moral difference, because again, I don't think that those cultures are better, but still, if you want to make any good, well, you're not going to make it, and you're not in this sense actually making a great work of civilization if you pretend that there should be just a plain adaptation to those standards. This has been brutally evident with multiculturalism that has utterly failed, because it's basically pretended to force in people without any kind of they wouldn't even be open to dialogue, to stay together for the sake of it, which is an autoimmune disease, right? It's a mental illness. It's not. It doesn't have any dignity of moral worth or kind of educational value, or I don't even know, but it's surely an anti-scientific principle. Communitarianism also made damage, meaning that there's no such thing, of course, like a standard culture was always the same, and that didn't undergo changes. And in Westerners, very often, sometimes from the conservative side of the aisle, both the as I was saying before, something that is more in fact underdeveloped civilizationally speaking, that the best of conservatism should reject. That is to say, the myth that people were always the same thing, and that is ironically truer the more primitive and underdeveloped you are, right? Because first of all, you're less rich in culture, so there's literally less to change, and secondly, simply it doesn't mean that you don't have a moral capacity, because if you are restricted in that kind of situation, you simply know less, and therefore you don't know how to cope concretely with the complexity of a system that can do more and better. And so many Westerners buy in this bullshit, and they interpret any kind of criticism in this sense as an abandonment of tradition, and that reveals just how poor their allegedly cultural background actually is, because they don't know anything about the achievements of their own culture, their own tradition, in that matter, and what that properly means in history, which changes, right? And it doesn't mean that you have to abandon everything, or even just the greater part of it. It means that you have to cope with new challenges that, if you don't know how to cope with, means probably that your background was not really that much, which is exactly what happened to the people that we wiped out from the face of the earth in the process. And that's what I care about to stress, because you're basically, if the West topped that, in what I think it was actually a moral sense, because again, if you can't even defend your own system, yes, you can be overwhelmed by something superior, but the fact still you can't cope with that, or make it a smooth process, it's some form of stupidity, right? And so a country or a culture that cannot defend themselves alone really have very deep problems. So if the West is changing also so fast and so for the worse, is actually fault of the majority of Westerners that actually do not understand much about what made the West great, because of course there are a bunch of underschooled morons without any kind of moral dignity that in fact caused this problem to the people that instead would like to keep things working the way they did. So the only way to be skilled at that is studying history. There is no doubt about that. It's also living in the world, for that matter. There is no doubt. But having a scientific education, but without history, you really can't focus the real scale of those dynamics, right? Or even kind of acquiring sensitivity to kind of understand why they happen or not. And again, the more you study history, the quicker that becomes. So when I made a video last summer that was about this confidence that Europeans displayed dramatically in those say journey chronicles that were written in their travels between essentially to Asia, that are as old medievalists know, kind of a fortunate genre in medieval literature, because they're very useful also as sources, as we were saying before, for knowing the same Asia, right? As far as I know, there is a lot of studies about this kind of global perspective. I'm not really a fan of that, because I believe that, yes, there should be an awareness of the global dimension, but at the same time, the paradox here is that we're so hyper special. Like either you literally become a living encyclopedia, otherwise it becomes really challenging. Especially considering that, yes, you can be a very good researcher in finding some hidden correspondences, context, sources, etc. But you also need a degree of a pattern interpretation. It turns out that global studies are somewhat overrated at this point, because we found out that Um, First of all, either the explanations are too simplistic or deterministic, and of course superficial, unavoidably so. But especially our current degree of academic hyperspecialization doesn't allow us to read what we find out, because we lack this terms of comparison. That is, how many people do you know? You can be an expert about medieval literature and even this kind of travels across continents and so on, but like, let's assume you're a Westerner and you don't know anything about China. Well, at that point, it's as if, I don't know, you wanted to study classical antiquity, just studying Roman history and knowing nothing about Greek one, right? It doesn't make any sense. So it's very complex today to do this. Not just because China is a grotesque communist shithole, but also because it's and frankly an evil force in the world. But and so an extremely racist country, and of course an ethno-nationalistic based one. It's actually a paper tiger. It's disgusting sometimes to see how Western conservatives look at how good the Russians and the Chinese are now, because they are aggressive and but they're not really much. There is not a deep strategic value or moral force. It's utter misery, an appalling one, right? The real disgusting thing, it's rather ass in the sense that the reason why, yes, we're decaying morally speaking is it really should start with asking what you are doing yourself about picturing your the West in its intrinsic qualities, instead than flirting with realities that you don't even understand. But again, it's very difficult to have a dialogue with a country that under Maoism was responsible for the greatest abomination in the entire history of mankind, and that kind of razed to the ground all their historical and archaeological material just to rebuild it from scratch, not to look like in fact the unspeakably offensive reality that they are, when they kind of came back to realize after the utter failure of their lunacy, or the great leap forward, the Cultural Revolution, when they ended up essentially killing each other, because that's how stupid that was, that they had at least to boast to the rest of the world the fact that they had some kind of care for historical consideration. How can you have a dialogue with such people? It's really difficult to say today, at the beginning of the third millennium. As an anecdote, I said even recently, where there was a Chinese student came to our university, and some years ago, I mean, my tutor had to explain her what religion was. Like, how can you be a human being in the world and trying to understand it, and not knowing? I mean, it was not this girl's fault. Of course, those are raised as brainwashed automatons, and just with paranoia, and hence expressly educated to deny reality by default, like it was just in the Soviet Union, as it was in because that's the anti-universal value we're talking about today. So what we are fiercely and proudly and necessarily opposed to, right, in a moral and scientific sense. But the point is, I have to still cope with you. Right, it's like, how do we cope with, I don't know, fascists and communists in our own communities? I mean, it's a huge problem because these people are mentally ill. So what do you want to do about them? They're not mentally ill because they were born like that, or they have a virus or anything. These people are self-damaging themselves in ways that kind of our democratic civic standards tell us that we really can't do much about. And it's kind of good that extremism exists in the world, because without that, orthodoxy would sclerotize. So actually, part of what the reason why the West is okay, but let's say it's still not a positive thing, right? In the first place, like, if anything, for these people, but also for the problems that they cause to the healthy ones. In any case, what we see in those chronicles in the 13th century, where the Pax Mongolica opened, let's say, the great transcontinental routes, and so the genre already existed before and continued later, but that was the kind of the peak. We see that Westerners were confident in what they found, right? They were not amazed by what they saw, even though they had never seen it. This is a very interesting and kind of remarkable acknowledgement. That is to say, I'm not aware practically of any other culture, if not maybe just the Arabs at the time of glory, let's say in the early Middle Ages, when they, became cultured and they started roaming the world, in fact, from, Iceland to, in fact, Southeast Asia, etc., and discovering and kind of, sticking also to that Hellenistic and Roman literature, traveling literature that unfortunately we have partly lost. The Arabs, we know they knew actually a lot more about that ancient world than we know today because of the fortune that they found in the great Hellenistic libraries. But I can't think of any other culture, etc., where at least the degree of the confidence and in the logical and approach to reality actually was. You would say, well, but the Europeans sometimes wrote now that we're monsters in Asia, all this. Well, that speaks mostly for the rationale, and it depends, because, that can be just one guy that wrote that, and in that video, in fact, I explained this thing too. The others weren't quite reasoning like that. They had, first of all, a very pragmatic, they had a reason for which they were, first of all, going to Asia, and secondly, why they were actually even writing about certain things, what they saw there, and the way they do it is often, kind of actually realistic. But aside from that, it's rather the realization that Westerners already by that point, not knowing this dramatic much about the rest of the world, by that point, obviously, still were confident in their beliefs and worldview and mindset to and open in this sense, very highly so, in integrating any kind of information they saw in a coherent, comprehensive system. They were not shocked or, they couldn't, or were cognitively dissonant in learning something that, for them it was not possible. They just registered. They didn't even comment it that much. They simply said, look, we found this thing. And so, good for us to know. And then, sometimes also describing further, interacting with it, and being curious and being open and having their own ideas, but not being dramatically impressed by that, and not having an emotionalistic reactions to that, and simply getting that and reviewing. And that's a great legacy in terms of especially Hellenic thought, philosophy, rationality, so all these things. That is quite important to have, let's say, survive in that dimension. So it's mostly, the problems with the West has been mostly a Western creation, right, in criticism, like the idea that, I don't know, the Middle Ages, for example, were a dark age, etc. Well, if in the 13th century the Western attitude toward the rest of the world was that, you gotta review the idea that there was a dark age somewhere at any point, and what they in the blossoming of that exultingly, superbly splendid medieval civilization, these people had managed to actively take from the past, but also from the present, as we will see now with the same Asian output, and to integrate a more comprehensive, positive, lucid view of reality that is actually very relevant, in my opinion. And so the 13th century is a bit the watershed, and so today we will look at what was like the knowledge before that, because it's a bit least, it's what we don't focus more than much. What happened in the 13th century was mostly the European contact with deep Asia, right? That up to that point had been fundamentally ignored, right? The Westerners had reached the Far East and so on, but the Romans went to China all the time, like kind of, this is very much known, but let's say having a concrete understanding of the world, you even look at the geographical notion where was poor, right? The same Romans knew those places because they went there. But for example, they didn't know Russia as such, right? Extensionally, like they were not interested because objectively there was not much to be interested in. Whereas in the Urals they knew pretty well what Rome was, which is yet another interesting perspective. So up to that point, Europeans had relied mostly just on geographical legends that accompanied but didn't quite substantiate eventually from a further understanding all the goods that came in the Mediterranean and in Europe proper from those countries, because we know that trade was, as you know, it came from very, very far, right? All of Asia, even up to Oceania, there was a contact with that. All the great human civilization. All the continents were in contact with each other, right? It's ridiculous to think that the early civilizations spread across continents normally, right? It was a very kind of very extremely tiny bits at a time, so that we have to think, okay, that at some point, I don't know, America was discovered or things like these. But that was mostly opening, like breaking a dam, right, rather than accomplishing who knows what in terms of the discovery of the place. It was just enormous because of the civilizational force that brought to that opening, rather than the actual acknowledgement per se, right? And this is quite important because, as you know, also the brutality of colonialism showed how it's easy to grab, to know, and to destroy. And so it's it depends on what we want to do with that. So that happened also in time in European history in which universalistic unity had fundamentally been broken, or at least irreparably damaged forever. So things were much more complicated than what they saw. But still, the conflictual process that it triggered, also within, not much even with competition with the other peoples in the world, but rather between the same Europeans for the conquest of the world, which is another thing, is it's quite emblematic also why and how much we developed for that matter in that period. Now the Romans knew the frankincense road that from the extremity of the Arabian Peninsula led to the precious spices coming from via sea from India, from China up to the Mediterranean. And as we were saying, they also had mercantile relations, right? Okay, they were mediated, right? And especially Rome and China, as you know, were quite interested in each other's, interaction, commercially speaking. They knew a few about each other, but they knew that, those goods passed and, they came back. And so with, the interest and so on. So that was quite relevant for them. The main issue was the Silk Road, the continental routes, because those were always threatened by some kind of, in fact, competitor, namely the Persians, at that point that controlled unavoidably the most important land routes, and that in fact especially the Romans tried to knock out in order to facilitate that further passage. And but Alexander the Great, as you know, had pushed up to India, and he would have probably conquered it because from a strategical point of view it would have been, the most sensible thing to do. Also, Augustus wanted to conquer India. I mean, the Westerners were a bit fixated with India, and that's also, in fact, most of the legions, the tales about Asia came from, since an early age, and so how Alexander's story ended, and so yet the moral impact that the greatest world's conqueror had in that sense is, we can say opened forever the true cultural meeting of East and West, because let's say the legends, the romances, as you know, in the Middle Ages, this is often overlooked. The great epos is not much about the Christian heroes or even the Romans. It's actually about Alexander, right? And actually, in the Islamic civilization, Alexander is even bigger than for Westerners, and that's another overlooked thing. Alexander Iskander is the immense, it's something enormous, because it was properly understood what had been created there. It's not just because the Arabs eventually took over roughly something similar to what Alexander had conquered, let's say, and so they lived also in the wake of those local legions that still, of all these peoples that they conquered, that remembered and believed and so on. Think about all the Alexanders founded all across the Middle East and so on. But it's properly about the great Alexander's accomplishment of creating a unique world where these two cultures could, in a sense, could be hybridized but still maintaining their own character. And so something that probably nobody else managed to accomplish ever, historically speaking. And of course also Alexander's legacy from a strictly political point of view went literally destroyed. The Romans had, however, given up utilitaristically, as only the Romans in a way could do, given up India. They had looked especially at that Mediterranean world that they knew better. And properly under Augustus, there is the completion of the European dimension of the empire. But they had a lot of travelers and of encyclopedists such as Pomponius Mela, Pliny the Elder, Solinus, that had worked consistently over time to fill that gap, let's say, of knowledge at their disposal on the Asian continent, with a quantity of data that in part responded to a reality was often misunderstood, and that in part was treated by legendary elaborations, and it's difficult even, of course, to trace a boundary. But let's say much also of what we see of medieval prejudice, all the story of monsters, of things that apparently do not make sense, is it's a philological shortcoming of the Westerners, right? There are literally certain figures, such as the unicorn, for example, that have nothing legendary or historical. Not because unicorns do not exist, or at least they existed as long as they kept selling narwhals' horns, and they believed the animal existed for real, and so it did exist. But because the unicorn was literally a complete creation of that the Westerners had made by putting together information that they took from Asia that had nothing to do with the figure of the unicorn, that was not known there, if not for some other horned animals that had certain specific meanings, and goats are plenty of that, in India and China and so on. And they completely invented, made up in a way that didn't make any sense. So also much of this is evident. We have seen it in these various creatures of monsters, of animals, or fantastic beings that they were often like a sedimentation of this obviously mediated and misunderstood knowledge that had passed, as you understand it, with the methods of transmission of the time from over such enormous time and space, right? So it's kind of normal at the same point. But the Westerners were aware of that world. So the medievals that inherited a great part of of this material, at least an enormous lot was actually lost, if not properly destroyed, as you know, but much was also recovered, safeguarded and treasured, and therefore Europeans never forgot at any time that, of course, that Asia existed in the first place. I mean, Jerusalem, the most important city for Christians, is there, but and generally speaking, also many other religions, also the Bible, of course, was the obvious evidence of that. But say they didn't forget about Asia from a cultural point of view, from all this strange information that they were fascinated with, because of course, as in a creationist, you have to make sense of that. You have to explain that. You have to be to first of all to relate with the authority that talked about such things, and secondly say what kind of logic does this fit in creation? So what does God really want us to understand through these info fundamentals? And it's important to stress that that idea of the Dark Ages that we have, which is appallingly disgusting enough, it was nothing dark in the Middle Ages, if not a contraction in sources production for something that normally ranges for roughly 1.5 centuries, right? Not more, over the medieval millennium. Has brought us to think that, I don't know, in the Dark Ages, nobody traveled, nobody knew anything, trade did not exist, everybody was there waiting for doom or something like that. Well, of course it's bullshit, and not just we know it from the fact that, in fact, there is no evidence for that, but secondly, there is evidence for a lot of exchanges, in transcontinental one. We know that certain stones came only from places, I don't know, were in Afghanistan, or stuff came from China. Even in some of the even contexts that you wouldn't think to be particularly internationally connected, these contexts actually existed, and they were kind of normal in the sense that if we find like an early medieval evidence of that, it means that we know. That tells us that there was a much greater part that we don't see because of documentary problems, not much because there wasn't, right? It was a simpler system that left us less evidence on a longer run, but let's say this doesn't mean that in relative terms there was not such connection. And so even just to go from Europe to Afghanistan, right, there must be a hell of an interest and therefore some kind of demand and offer that evidently do not speak for any kind of darkness or brutal oblivion. The same goes for the same knowledge. There was always connected, even in the absence of material contact, or say, but still in the world of imagination, that you would be surprised at how powerful it was. There are some works, and we always underestimate the moral dimension for that matter, some monastic authors' works, right? People that we know in some instances were living in a monastery for all their lives. They had never traveled, or at least that's another myth. Actually, monks did often move, but just not everybody, and in any case, not necessarily to other countries for that matter, but through the knowledge that was sedimented and always consulted in the European libraries, these monks were able to express, to create in their mind and to express beautifully, poetically, artistically, and scientifically perfect descriptions of the actual environments that we, if you go to Asia, you would immediately say, hell, but they have been there to know such a thing, because they actually described the thing. They had never been. They had known it through those works. And so that shows you how easy distances are can be bridged, can be, if you just want it, right, before then even going physically there, which is something we unfortunately don't do anymore. We arrived at the point where people just travel en masse to, go in places that they don't know anything about, they don't read anything about, they're fundamentally not interested about, they don't understand their historical or cultural relevance. They go in front of a monument, they take a selfie, they post it on Instagram, they come back home, and they just keep wasting time and nothing else, right? So you can be physically there, but mentally you have never been there. Those people were never physically there, but they were mentally there. That's what we should learn from the Middle Ages, by the way. That was the age in the entire history of mankind where people were more inexhaustibly thirsty of knowledge than in any other. There's no absolute doubt at all, right? The Enlightenment was mostly obsessed with finding descriptive categories, but not much of investigating that their actual substance, right? Their actual nature. It was about rather, let's find a system that can make us sort out the whole thing. There were pros and cons, but properly knowledge per se, the way it was craved in the Middle Ages was never craved in the history of mankind. So for Europe, that also had Islamic dominations, as you know, at times, the Arabs had a great importance because they kind of opened Europeans to Asia, about which they knew a few, right? The Arabs instead were habituated to travel in that continent. So when I talk about Arabs, I talk about very often, especially in the same Europe, about Arabicized elites, right? So we're talking about Arab, read even in there mostly Greek, Roman, Persian culture, right? Mostly. Some elements did from also certain areas of Arabia, especially in the south, but also India, especially, that were developed enough, and surely, many other places that included the same Europe in a way, and China, but brought to this enormity of knowledge because they knew the continent. They traded dramatically with it. Arab merchants, again, went up to Indonesia. That's how far Islam spread. And up to the 9th century, the merchants of the Persian Gulf frequented China, for example, while the Javan ships reached, favored by the regimes of the periodic winds known as monsoons, up to the Arabic Peninsula. And even by land, trade was florid, right? The ancient Silk Road that began at some point. Alexander did contribute to that. Let's say it's difficult to say when the Silk Road properly was born, but let's say it definitely intensified over time. That point from antiquity, let's say, connected, especially the fertile, let's say the Chinese fertile plains of the Uang-tse and of the Huang-ho, protected by the Great Wall, to the Arab Iranic metropolis of Shiraz, Isfahan, the same Baghdad, right? So through essentially the Gobi Desert, the Turkestanian oasis, and passing by the Himalaya chain, and between China and Persia especially, there were some small reigns that had developed that were normally vassals, either of the one or the other across time. This had been something since antiquity. Think about the Sogdians, who were the bankers of the situation in the area, because they profited from the trade routes, right? So that's an interesting dimension, like the Central Asian, but from the Middle Eastern side, where say areas that at the time, in fact, were, especially before the Mongol conquests, were the most populated areas in the world. Khiva, the ancient Antioquia in Margiana, was the most populated city in the world before the Mongols razed it to the ground, right? So in places that you look today, there isn't really much there anymore, but there are the vestiges of such places because they made an enormous fortune because of trade. They were also relatively fertile, depends on the area and the main rivers across, but let's say those were mostly something hybrid between the steppe and sedentary societies in a way. That's part of the reason also why not much of a much greater civilization could develop there. But the fact that they were located on the Silk Road, developed, interestingly enough, the trade centers that were very often also extremely thriving scientifically. Like some of the greatest Islamic scholars, philosophers were often from areas like the one of Khorasan, for example, because it turns out that the fact they were exposed to multiple cultures at once, like Arab, Persian, Turkish, and plus even in the surroundings, even of course there was some Indo-European relic and influences all around. Like they objectively exposed them to so many cultures. They opened their own minds, right? And so they came back from places that were considered like the periphery to places like Baghdad, so the universal capital of Islamic world, that searched for top scholars, and they would find in the periphery, not really into those more demographically and agriculturally developed areas like Mesopotamia and other developed centers of the Dar al-Islam. And so this is where between the great empires, the Caliphate and China, etc., the goods passed from caravan to caravan. And the mercantile organization contemplated that the single convoys would make just brief path, right, from oasis to oasis, so that they would entrust essentially the loads to other convoys of the same type. This was definitely an effective system because it wasn't just the same person necessarily that made the wall crossing. That naturally was also risky. So there was this kind of efficient systems. But consider also that there was another issue that was evident before and after the Mongol Empire. That is to say that all these local powers, yes, thrived because of this intercontinental trade, but were also kind of attrition in it. Like because they exacted their own share of the toll, right? Why did eventually Europeans started going in great numbers to China all of a sudden as soon as the Mongol Empire occurred? Because of course they cut all the tolls, right? They would pay them just from at the beginning or the end. There was no other power in between, ideally, that would ask for money when the Mongols were in charge, because they controlled the whole thing, and so all the way were open. Instead, by the 14th century, not only the Mongol Empire had disgregated, but also the crisis had kicked in, and so these things closed once again. And part of the reason also we got the plague was because of that, not very differently from today from China, even though the rights are different in most of them. And so you can argue that yes, in this sense, people traveled relatively along these routes before, but the goods and together with the ideas and the cults actually traveled quite fast, right, over very long roads, but still bringing in the knowledge, that the realization, as we were saying before, that we radically underestimate is what these things had, what effect they had on human mind. I mean, think it in a long-term perspective. Like, civilization is quite young, right? As we've seen, humans have always known each other from the other continents. They've always been in contact. But let's say one thing is whether that happens just every once in a while. One thing is whether this thing starts becoming consistent, and people start kind of growing because of what they learned through this. So the most requested and expensive goods traded and prized in Europe were gold and silver from Sumatra, Malaysia and Korea, the sandal, which is a plant that were eventually the shoe, but the bamboo, the camphor tree, from which a very appreciated scent was extracted, aromas such as the incense and the moss, precious stones such as rubies and sapphires that came from Ceylon or from India. But the richest market was perhaps the one of the spices properly meant, right? We're talking about pepper, nutmeg, cloves, cinnamon, and some of these products were functional to were like food, just like, for example, the least expensive food, for example, were of less value, but they were exported in more significant quantities. For example, sugar cane, rice, cereals. While the heavy goods, and however the relatively cheap one, were usually transported by sea, because it would have been too costly at that point to transport them on donkey back or on camel's back. And so there were pros and cons relative to this, and as you know, mostly land routes were gradually ever less. In the long run, also the Silk Road kind of died on a very long run, but because, of course, of navigation techniques and all these things, but over time. But in general, right, waterways were cheaper, right? Even the threats posed by storms or something was relative compared to what could happen to you on land with brigands and all the worst kind of. Even think about the climates, right? Crossing from China to the Middle East, right? It's not an easy journey for sure. And of these great and as you understand, also thriving powers in the East. Let's say the Westerners knew relatively a few, or if not anything, practically, because the communal civilization were the ones more invested in trade usually, and they mostly knew Asia in the sense of the Anatolian Peninsula, so Asia Minor, and so and the most, the closest areas to the Lebanese Palestinian coast. So the hinterland was just, they were not interested because, of course, for them, especially for the Italian merchants, it was enough just to control the ports. So what the hell cared what happened in the hinterland? It was not the point. The point was, to grab, to put their hands on the goods and the tolls in the choke points, right? So that was so important. But unavoidably, as we were saying before, they would be exposed to the knowledge of that, yes, there was something beyond that. So, in fact, the Westerners were very interested, actually, in the places where these spices came from, right? Especially for that economical reason, because they were also an important part of their lives. They were also important preserving foods and so on, and also because of the precious gems or clothes of which the Christian princes and liturgy made great use. Right, we made a video last summer too, also about what kind of products were traded, and so how, especially, of course, the most transcontinental trade was mostly pushed by these elites, and so what they could use in with greater expense because of their affluence, and so the paraphernalia of the church, the most precious clothes of the nobility, all these things that they were mostly, sometimes you see it's Chinese textile. Of course, Europeans also began to imitate them. They imported silk, and all these things, but let's say that came a bit later, also consistently. There were properly also more ideal interests in general, because, for example, Europeans talked about the terrestrial paradise that, according to some of them, was located in the most extreme part of the East, right? But it was rendered inaccessible by a fire barrier that surrounded it. And so there were some Arab and Byzantine legions that were taken as true, that spoke of prodigious places. There is, we can verify them, at least many of them, in that masterpiece of Arab literature that is the Thousand and One Nights, such as the magnetic mountain in the Indian Ocean that basically attracted all the metal objects that were on the ships, for which they would have been to be built without nails, and of monsters such as the dog wolf heads, right? That could have been something coming easily from Chinese art and Chinese zodiac. The chapeaux, right, with a single foot that they would use to cover themselves from the sun, or the blemie that, as you know, were actually a people, had been at least a people from there were essentially a people between Egypt and the Red Sea ridges, the ridges in between the Red Sea and the Nile Valley, I mean, antiquity, that according to these legends brought the face on their chest. And there are many, there are all kind of rationalizing explanations of where Europeans could have gotten this. And there are some monsters in some Asian religions, mythologies, etc., that kind of looked similar to that, but they weren't quite that, right? And for not talking about the animals. And towards the mid-12th century, also true, the Byzantines had arrived in Europe, even to the court of Pope Alexander III and of the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick I Barbarossa, a letter that talked about the various marvels of Asia and of a great and powerful Christian kingdom that existed there, at the head of which would have been a mysterious king priest known as Prester John. Famously enough, this Prester John that appeared all the time, and that's interesting, even just morally, because you see, it's as if the Europeans were projecting and they never abandoned that idea, right? America was discovered for that purpose, that they could essentially Christianize all that world, and that they could find, let's say, a correspondence of that, of themselves in a way, because they wouldn't conceive the idea that it was something like Islam, for example. Even the great scholars of the medieval Europe, of course, they knew that Islam was something different. Whoever went there knew it was a different religion. But let's say, in a scholarly sense, there couldn't be something like an alternative religion to Christianity. The same Dante believed that Muhammad was just a schismatic Christian priest, right? So, but there was a moral reason for which it was said that. Of course, Dante knew that things were not like that, but it was important for Europeans to reason like it, because, of course, they still saw things very much from their own perspective, and it was normal in the history of civilization to have that boundary, that barrier, of which they had to make sense by also projecting their own hopes about what would be beyond that, across that. So, a work like the one of Prester John, for example, is almost certainly propagandistic, right? This letter contained, however, allusions to real historical facts. For example, the organization of some Turkic Mongol kingdoms in Central Asia, or, for example, the existence of various Christian Nestorian communities that were spread all across the Silk Road from Iran up to China, that had been there. So famously enough, Christianity in China was quite a big thing at a point in early medieval times, and so it kind of makes sense, right? What the average expert on these topics would tell you, of course, is that it goes far beyond history or what you think. Look at these people had these opinions. It doesn't mean anything. You have to understand the context of these things, because they all made kind of sense in a way, not to the gullibility of people, but to properly the purpose for which they were written. And secondly, on the basis of something that was real, was actually based in reality. and that witnessed the capacity already to, to kind of make sense of the world in a way, and this broader notions that were, because everybody knew that things were there. I mean, we're not so different after all nowadays. I mean, you think we know the world, just why? Because we are exposed often to pictures that show us satellite maps. But do you actually know anything about the world? Like, do you study other countries' histories? Do you even say Asia today, right? It's mysterious for most of us. I'm the first one that doesn't actually know much about it because, there's so much to know, and of course I've been exposed mostly to the history of, my the near places, or the ones that, however, in fact, in a Western-centric way, that also denied in part more knowledge of the other continents, is let's say, is portrayed. And the same goes for within the same West. Like, how much do actually Europeans and Americans know each other? That's an issue for us, because we shouldn't be like that. And yet, so we're still very distant today, even though we can cover those distances in a few hours. It's the mental distances that are important, as always. And that's the good reason why we should be learning more. And I can tell you easily that I'm very, in the sense, narrow-minded. To me, I came to know mostly about just Western history, and specifically European one, and just expanding, what the proximities around the Mediterranean and so on. But it's the product there of right. It's because of our educational system. It's because of what we obviously tend to connect to things that are kind of matter to us because they're closer, right? But it still doesn't mean that the way the world works today can make us afford these boundaries anymore. And this has nothing to do with liking or disliking one culture or another. This is about knowing, and knowledge is knowledge. It's not like the judgment should exist, but it's another moment in the process, right? It's not even part of the same process, actually. So it's incredibly important to open your mind to things that you've never properly conceived, and it's the most difficult thing to do, exactly because you don't know they even exist sometimes. And so that is kind of tricky and dangerous in a way, and we should strive for at least making that effort to know more. And of course, you can be easily mind blown as well by how much in fact was just next door, and you didn't have any clue of, which I presume is also even more important, because that it really proves the point I make about the necessity of knowing history if you want to have any kind of political, civic, or moral literacy, or scientific literacy for that matter, in that we just tend not to have any more, right? It's been proven, we're getting dumber, right? There's no doubt, right? Throughout the 20th century, all the mess that happened, at least, kind of, at least our IQ increased steadily, right? IQ is not everything, but still, a good indicator for lots of things. Today, it's going down. That's an incredibly dangerous thing. Right, because we all know where that leads, kind of, in a world that is where you can't afford to have that anymore by the scale of complexity it has, right? So the more you talk about these things, the more you feel yourself small, meaning that it's the greatness of the globe that makes you think so. But in a sense, if you want to make sense of it, if you want to bite that, grab that, and you want to explore it, even to, that cannot come without destruction. That's yet another thing that, civilization has a cost, right? And an irreversible one. It's gonna damage something or somebody, right? So it's unavoidable. But the result may be very much worth it, and even more, right? So that's my take on it, and we will surely talk about. I don't, as you know, I don't make much global history in general, but we could begin with that, and at some levels at least. And so, but I don't think so, because I project to remain. Well, actually, as you know, I began something about Chinese warfare, then I didn't follow up with the usual topic cycles anymore. I started making this kind of more minimalistic things, but we'll resume that because that's important, and that can actually help to measure better what happened in the other, even in Europe at the time. Because what's the point of liking something but not being able to give it that dimension outside of it? It can be very risky. That's what we all do when we refuse, let's say, to look beyond, right? So that's I can tell you for certain, even though I can assure you that doesn't make you lose what you believe. At the beginning it may seem disorienting, but the more you go on with that, the more it makes sense again. So it's always by stages, and it works always like that with knowledge, but it doesn't leave you. It actually reinforces and makes you understand better what you think you should be kind of proud of, what your abilities are, not much the legacy of what you think, the wake of what you think you to leave in, and it's just about how much you're capable of making, what you kind of attribute to just being born, or to, or where, like, so that makes you feel that's actually a declaration of weakness until you do something that proves that you kind of leave on some important legacy that is important universally, right? For everybody in the world. In any case, for now we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.